Good day, everyone. With recent events such as rising temperatures, animal species going extinct, harsh weather conditions all over the world, it's just about time that we tackle the topic of climate change, particularly through the lens of Peter Singer in his book Practical Ethics, Chapter 9. Back then, it was easy for communities to live remotely and limit the harm they cause to others due to the lack of proximity and interconnectedness than ever. However, due to globalization, we are more interconnected than ever before. This means that there are more bridges for our actions to affect one another. What would the singer mean by this? Basically, all human activities affect people worldwide, even the smallest action of using a private vehicle that emits carbon dioxide instead of lessening your carbon footprint by making use of public transportation. On a bigger scale, Singer illustrated this through the World Health Organization, where they cite the amount of deaths due to global warming has significantly rose to the point where, at a weekly rate, there are as many deaths to the terrorist attack on September 11, 2001. The causes of death include malaria, dengue, diarrhea, and malnutrition. Additional to that, fourth assessment report of the Intergovernment Panel of Climate Change forecasts significant stress on weather resources and coastal flooding due to the rising of temperatures and sea levels. This possesses harm to 2.5 to 3.2 billion people. Rising sea levels are as bad as causing mass displacement to 4 million people as two islands in the Sundarbans region have completely vanished. This is a new form of harm or the consequences of actions across generations that are significantly catching up now at an alarming rate. Although Singer underscores that causing distant and imperceptible harm through the release of waste gases is a new form of harm that we do not instinctively or emotionally respond to, making it difficult for us to recognize it even as harm. Thus, Singer ultimately challenges the notion that our only duty to strangers is to avoid harming them, arguing that climate change shows that we are actively harming millions of the world's poor. Regardless of differing ethical views, we must cease harm and compensate for the damage already caused by climate change, which will persist for at least a century. This leads to the call for international agreements and a global ethic to address climate change, outlining the responsibilities of both nations and individuals, which are the ways which we will be discussing throughout this session. Moving on to the question, who is accountable? Who should cut down the most? What is the concept of enough as good and as good? To start, Singer illustrates the reality of pollution and its exponential growth per generation through an analogy of a giant, seemingly limitless drain. In this analogy, we imagine living in a village where everyone disposes their waste down a giant drain because it disappears and it doesn't bother anyone. However, this practice is passed down to generations. Over time, upon checking the drain, it is revealed that it is almost filled to the brim, not leaving enough space or giving enough opportunity for the future to have it as good as you found the drain, which is John Locke's idea of enough and as good. We compare this analogy to the state of our atmosphere, as over time it became evident that the atmosphere's ability to absorb greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide and methane is finite. The pre-industrial revolution level of carbon dioxide was 270 ppm, but it rose to 390 ppm by 2010, with an annual increase of 2 ppm. James Hansen from the US National Aeronautics and Space Administration and his colleagues advocate reducing atmospheric carbon dioxide to 350 ppm to preserve a habitable planet. The current level has already surpassed this target, indicating an overuse of the atmospheric drain. Singer then questions, how can we decide on who should cut down the most? So, let's look into what would be an equitable distribution. We have three concepts to look into, which is historical responsibility, equal shares, and luxury versus subsistence. Before diving in, let's look into the two kinds of principles that we will be applying to the concepts. First is the historical principle, where the evaluation of justice of a distribution is based on the history and legitimacy of acquisition. Let's go back to the example of the drain given earlier. Using the historical principle, elders who have dumped their waste are responsible for cleaning up the drain or reversing its effects, not the generation who had not contributed to the waste. Next is the time slice principle, where the judgment of distribution of responsibility is only based on that specific moment without regard to its history. So the generation who will be living in the same area as the drain, since they will be the one benefiting from the environment around it, they will be the one responsible for cleaning. In support of the historical principle, in a more concrete level, Singer used the polluter pays concept, or oftentimes taken as you broke it, you fix it. This principle would mean that each country would have proportional responsibility, especially for countries that have significantly contributed to the carbon dioxide emissions that is still around today due to industrialization. As we move forward to discuss the Industrial Revolution along with its global impact and its objections, Singer recognizes that the Industrial Revolution benefited the entire world, but it also enabled industrialized nations to colonize and dominate the global trading system, disproportionately benefiting those nations. Despite the global benefits, the emissions from industrialization can be fairly attributed to industrialized nations due to the disproportionate benefits they have received. However, industrialized nations didn't know that their emissions would be harmful for most of the industrial period. Like, for example, in 1896, Savante Arenas predicted fossil fuel burning would increase atmospheric carbon dioxide and heat the planet, though he believed that it would be beneficial. Now, let's move on to the concept that follows the time slice principle. Equal shares calls for an equal action across nations or communities since we all exist under the same atmosphere. So there must be a collective effort, unlike calling for proportional conduct in the historical responsibility concept. In the 2009 Nations Summit meeting, that the impact of climate change in America will be more severe compared to other parts of the world. President Kagame highlighted that the climate change is not largely Africa's fault, emphasizing Africa's minimal contribution to the problem. Despite this, he suggests moving past assigning blame to industrialized nations, stressing that the global struggle for survival should be a precedence over a blame game. Playing the blame game and calling for proportional action would be a long and difficult process too, and poor nations depend on agriculture more than the rich nations, leaving them in a shortage whenever there is drastic change in weather conditions, putting them at the shorter end of the stick. Singer used efforts of Southern Australia and the Netherlands to control flooding in order to illustrate the disparity between poor and rich nations. To further illustrate how it would work, under the shares principle, Sri Lanka could triple and India could nearly double their emissions while remaining within their per capita limits. Conversely, China would need to halve its emissions, Germany would need to reduce its emissions by more than 80%, and the United States, Canada, and Australia would need to cut their emissions to tenth of current levels, which is a daunting task, especially these are industrialized nations who provide exports to other parts of the world and also they import. So this illustration would make us think or even believe that the equal shares concept is ideal, however, it is unrealistic. Though Singer recognizes that dramatic reductions is not possible for industrialized nations like Germany and the United States in the short run, due to economic consequences which could possibly lead to political instability and policy reversals. So, there are mitigating factors to consider before concluding impossibility, one of which is creating greenhouse gas emission quotas and implementing carbon trading schemes. So there will be minimal economic costs, yet still be of benefit to the rich and poor nations.
Peter Singer delves into the concept of equitable distribution concerning luxury versus subsistence in the context of climate change. He draws on various ethical frameworks and real-world examples to explore how justice should guide decisions related to resource allocation and emissions reduction efforts. Singer starts by referencing John Rawls' influential work A Theory of Justice, where Rawls argues that justice requires prioritizing resources for those who are worse off if it improves their situation. This principle of prioritizing the needs of the disadvantaged is echoed in the 1992 United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which recognizes the importance of promoting sustainable development while acknowledging the differentiated responsibilities of nations. Henry Schu's contribution is also discussed as he proposed distinction between subsistence emissions and luxury emissions. Subsistence emissions refers to those necessary for basic needs and development in poorer countries, such as methane from rich paddles. On the other hand, luxury emissions pertain to excess or non-essential emissions such as those from recreational driving in affluent nations. Xu argues that just allocation of emission quotas should prioritize subsistence emissions over luxury emissions, reflecting a sense of justice and fairness. In a UN General Assembly debate on climate change in 2007, a Chinese diplomat echoed Xu's sentiments by advocating for accommodating subsistence and development emissions from poorer countries while restricting luxury emissions from wealthier nations. He highlighted the ethical difference between emissions needed for basic survival and those stemming from non-essential luxury consumption. Singer acknowledges that nations like Burkina Faso facing developmental challenges should not be obligated to curb emissions vital for their progress. This perspective aligns with the principle of equal per capita shares, which suggests that each individual should have an equal share of the global carbon budget. However, Singer points out a limitation in applying the luxury versus subsistence emission framework to countries like China. Despite China's significant population, it also has a sizable affluent class responsible for substantial emission due to their lifestyle choices. This complicates the narrative, especially when China advocates for wealthy nations to reduce luxury emissions while not fully addressing the luxury emissions within its own borders. Singer's discussion underscores the ethical imperative to consider the different impacts of emissions based on their necessity and contribution to basic needs versus non-essential or luxury consumption. By recognizing and prioritizing subsistence emission in allocation and policy decisions, there is a move towards a more equitable and just approach to addressing climate change on a global scale. Peter Singer raises the provocative question of whether the actions of rich nations in emitting high levels of greenhouse gases can be considered a form of aggression. He explored this idea by examining the consequence of climate change, the awareness of these consequences by affluent countries, and the ethical implications of prioritizing economic interests over global well-being. The term aggression is typically associated with direct acts of war or violence. However, Singer delves deeper into the concept, considering the indirect yet devastating impacts of climate change caused by affluent nations' emissions. These impacts include agricultural disruption, loss of natural resources, spread of diseases, and displacement of populations, particularly in vulnerable regions like Africa. Singer references President Yoweri Museveni's statement that rich nations are causing aggression through global warming, highlighting the severe consequences faced by developing countries due to climate change. He argues that while the actions of affluent nations may not be intentional acts of aggression, the resulting harm is comparable, if not more devastating, than conventional aggressive wars. Singer draws attention to the fact that the effects of climate change disproportionately impact disadvantaged communities, often in developing nations with limited resources to cope with environmental challenges. These populations face threats like extreme weather events, food insecurity, water scarcity, and displacement due to rising sea levels, all caused by human-induced climate change. One of the key points Singer raises is the doctrine of double effect, often used to justify action that may cause harm but are not intended for that purpose. However, he argues that in the case of climate change, this doctrine fails to justify the harm caused by greenhouse gas emissions. The harm inflicted, such as environmental degradation and human suffering, far outweighs any perceived benefits or goals pursued by affluent nations, such as maintaining a certain lifestyle or economic interests. Furthermore, Singer critiques the prioritization of economic interests and lifestyle over addressing climate change. He cites examples such as statements by former President George Bush and his administration, indicating a reluctance to take significant action on climate change if it conflicts with economic goals or the American way of life. The chapter concludes with a strong assertion that the harm caused by affluent nations' emissions knowingly and persistently can be likened to waging aggressive war on vulnerable populations. Singer holds these nations accountable for the harm they are causing and emphasizes the urgent need for ethical responsibility and action to mitigate climate change's destructive effects. Peter Singer delves into the individual responsibilities of citizens in affluent nations regarding climate change. He begins by reflecting on the clear ethical obligation individuals have when it comes to aiding those living in extreme poverty. However, he transitions to the complex questions of what individuals ought to do about climate change, considering the limited impact of individual lifestyle changes on such a global issue. Singer begins by emphasizing the clear obligation individuals have towards aiding the world's poor. This obligation includes not only urging governments to increase aid, but also taking personal action to contribute to effective aid agencies. He argues that individuals should act independently, especially when government fail to fulfill their responsibilities. The underlying principle is that if individuals can prevent significant harm without sacrificing anything of comparable moral significance, they are morally obliged to do so. Singer examines a scenario where an individual significantly reduces their carbon footprint by making sustainable lifestyle choices, such as adopting a plant based diet, improving home insulation, and using renewable energy sources. Despite these efforts, resulting in a substantial reduction in personal emissions, the overall impact on climate change may seem negligible. This raises the questions of whether individual actions can truly make a discernible difference in addressing climate change. Peter Singer explores the ethical consideration individuals face regarding their actions in the context of climate change. He discusses how different ethical frameworks such as consequentialism and non-consequentialism approach the questions of what individual ought to do. Singer's discussion underscores the importance of both individual actions and collective strategies in combating climate change. While individual choices matter and can contribute to a broader shift towards sustainability, systemic changes and international cooperation are crucial for achieving significant and lasting progress in addressing climate change. Singer then discusses the potential benefits of voluntary lifestyle changes, such as reducing emissions, even within a cap and trade scheme. While individual actions may not directly reduce overall emissions under such schemes, they can still have symbolic societal and political impacts. For instance, changes in consumption patterns can influence government policies, industry practices, and public awareness regarding climate change. Singer highlights a consensus among people that individuals are accountable for their emissions and the harm they cause, whether individually or collectively. This acknowledgement sets the stage for discussing the crucial role individuals play in advocating for policy changes that can slow down the rate of climate change. Peter Singer emphasizes the urgent need for individuals to take action in addressing climate change. He highlights the gravity of the risk posed by climate change to the planet and its entire population over the next century. Despite the severity of this risk, Singer observes that the level of protest and action against inaction has been relatively small. Singer concludes by stressing the importance of individual agency and responsibility in addressing global challenges like climate change. He urges individuals not to be passive spectators, but rather proactive agents of change, recognizing that collective efforts are essential in mitigating the potentially catastrophic effect of climate change on the planet and its inhabitants.